NEMOPHILA. They look happy, don't they? I certainly think they do. Anyway, welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Well, I don't know if that's actually what I'm going to call these. I suddenly decided that would be what I was going to call this because I've started doing these episodes on this channel where I'm going to talk about things that I think are important issues. Because, reacting to music is all well and good, but there's a lot of other things rather than, hey, check out this new song that are worth talking about. And one of them is the old thing of, well, NEMOPHILA now have one guitarist. Oh, well, technically, yeah, Maya, I know she's playing guitar. You look at the Beautiful Days video, she's got a guitar in there. But technically speaking, they have gone from having two well-known guitarists to having one guitarist. And I want to talk a little bit about NEMOPHILA, about BAND-MAID, about Lovebites. But we're starting mainly, and this was all provoked by the whole thing of NEMOPHILA being a four-piece band. Because when I did my awards on my main channel, Back a Broadcast, at the end of last year, I gave an award to NEMOPHILA for just everything they've produced since becoming a four-piece. Whether it be the Jingle Bells Rock thing, that cover, whether it be G.O.D, Beautiful Days. I think that this picture actually sums up very well how happy they seem to be and how free they seem to be. And I think most tellingly was their cover of Style, where when we heard that, it rocked just as hard as the previous version. G.O.D rocked just as hard as anything they'd done before. And then we had songs like Brainwash, and I was thinking, do you know what? They're even better at the heavier stuff. Now, this is not me slagging off Saki, because actually Saki is amazing. I commented myself, I'm not a big fan of just like music that is just guitar solos, but someone played me some of the songs that Saki's released, and I was like, okay, those are actually really good. I've never had any questions about Saki, but how good a musician is, you can have all the best musicians in the world. That doesn't make the best band. A band is more than just, hey, these people are really good. A band has to be picked to be the right people who work together to make a certain sound. And what I'm really here to talk about is, do you need two guitarists? Now, okay, some of you might be screaming at your screens or monitors, or whatever you're watching this on already. You might be screaming, Howard, how could you possibly argue about can you have two guitarists? Well, or do you need two guitarists? Look, the reason why I want to bring up this subject is because I think we can all name bands that have one guitarist who we love, who have two guitarists that we love, and this is all fine. But I think there is a little bit of a, shall we say, a little bit of a default position with a lot of people in the rock world of, well, of course you need two guitarists. We had conversations on Ears to the East, the podcast I do with Neon Reaper and Reactor Matt, where we've talked about, things like, oh, what's a perfect band lineup and something like that. And always it's like, well, who should be the rhythm guitarist? Who should be the lead guitarist? Just the default assumption there should be two guitarists. When NEMOPHILA, when Saki departed from NEMOPHILA, everyone was like, well, who's going to replace her? I was like, do we need to replace her? I know some people were thinking about, well, because they want to keep on doing the songs they were doing before, but I was listening to songs they did before, and I was like, most of these don't really need two guitarists, and I think they proved that very well with Style. I think a lot of people, when they listen to Style, would have pointed out those little breaks in the song where there was the interplay between the two guitars and gone, well, you can't do that with just one guitarist. Well, I challenge you to listen to the new version of Style and find that feels in any way lacking. It doesn't. It just, when you have one guitarist, sometimes you just become better at using that one guitar. And moreover, having one guitarist frees you up a lot of the time. Because when you have two guitarists, yeah, there are lots of things you can do. But when there is two guitarists, the opposite side of that is that sometimes you feel pressured to put more layers of guitar into a song than it necessarily needs. Now, this is where the conversation really, for me, is interesting. Because if we think about it, there's a lot of really interesting bands who, in the past, you've only had one guitarist who we would assume, well, I'm going to say, for example, the example I used recently was Rage Against the Machine. Not everyone's cup of tea, I accept. But Rage Against the Machine, I don't think anyone would listen to them and go, well, they just didn't sound heavy enough. They sounded plenty heavy, and the one guitarist they had half the time was playing sounds that were not traditional distorted guitar, Tom Morello, because, he was off doing all kinds of other weird sound effects as well. You don't need two guitars to be heavy. I mean, you could argue, if that's just the thing, more guitars means heavier and heavier, then that's when you get onto sounds that we have in some songs where they just go into a studio and they play the same line about 20 times and they layer it up. And that leads to what a lot of people complain about oh, the thick compressed guitar sounds that we get in songs. Sometimes just more guitar doesn't make things heavier. It just makes them sound more compressed. So, sometimes the most energetic, powerful, and heavy sound you can have is the one that's the most raw, the most biting. And I think this was proven really well by NEMOPHILA when they did the song Brainwash that came out quite recently, which I think most people would accept is one of the heaviest things they've done in a very long time. You compare that to Dissension, and Dissension is a song that is supposed to sound very heavy, but to me, my criticism has always been that it sounds too clinical, a bit too clean, a little bit too compressed, a little bit too... It doesn't have much rawness to it, in my opinion. Whereas Brainwash really does. And yes, I know there are other differences in the song, but just to me, you don't need two guitars to be heavy. Okay, so what about sounding full? What about sounding interesting? I mean, take, for example, bands like Queen. Again, looking at an older legacy band, but Queen, they just had the diversity. They could do more poppy songs and they could do more like heavy songs. They only needed Brian May and that one guitar. And I guess my point is, if you have a really good guitarist and you have really good writing, you don't need two guitars to be heavy. And you don't necessarily need two guitars for anything, unless you're specifically in the mindset of writing that way. So in the case of NEMOPHILA, a band who clearly have an interest in a diverse range of styles. I mean, look at the songs they've produced simply, like I say, since becoming a four-piece anyway. You have their them redoing Style, which is kind of a little bit of new metal. You have Brainwash, which is just pure heavy. You have Beautiful Days, which is a much more of a ballad-esque song. You have G.O.D, which is going sort of hard rock meets metal direction. And you look at their previous albums. Clearly, they have an interest in a diversity of sound. So for me, I think having one guitarist is better because it means that they can still be as heavy as ever, as they have proven, but they don't have to be heavy. They can also do songs where we go, well, look, we want to do a song that just doesn't really need two guitars. Just one guitar's enough. Keep it like nice and spaced out. Give it room to breathe. I think that's great. So for me, I think for a band like this, yeah, fantastic. Now, just as a little bit of a counter, because I don't want to sound like I'm just hating on bands with two guitars, you have other examples which go in a different direction. Let's take in, for example, Lovebites. Now, Lovebites, they have two guitarists. Could they work with one guitarist? Yes, they could, but I think Lovebites' sound, they have much more of a genre. I always get hate when I start talking about specific types of subgenres, and I'm not a big fan of talking about subgenres anyway. So I know that I've heard people call it like power metal, thrash metal. I don't care. That quick kind of melodically driven heavy metal that has a slightly thrashy vibe to it. That thing that they do, that thing that bands like Hagane have started doing a kind of a similar version of as well in recent years. That kind of thing. Yeah, two guitars works for this. Why does it work for them? Well, their music is always going to be guitar focused. I guess you could always have Miyako playing a bit of piano. That would work as well. And that's, again, one of the benefits of having multi-instrumentalist. But ultimately, a lot of what they do, it charges along, and then the solos are a big part of their songs. But I've always said that with Lovebites, one of the things I like about their solos is that it's very different from most other bands where a solo's kind of like this cool little moment of screeching guitar. With them, there's something almost orchestral about the way they do it. I always use this example, so apologies for using it again, but Glory to the World for me is a beautiful example of how to do this. It sounds like a Bach organ piece. Just the way it builds up, and you get all the little arpeggios and everything, and the scales are building up and building around each other, and the two guitars work together to slowly build this swell of guitar that shoots you into usually the crescendo of the song. So could they do it with other instruments? Yes, but clearly what they do is written around and focused very heavily on two guitars. They're not as much looking to do like the wide range of different genres that NEMOPHILA want to do. NEMOPHILA obviously want to do some songs that are quite poppy. They want to do songs that have a little bit of a hip-hop vibe. They want to do songs that go heavy. They want to do all of that. And so being tied to having two guitarists, not so important for them. But for Lovebites, it makes sense. And Lovebites for me is an example of a band where, yeah, have two guitarists because it works. And that brings us on to the interesting middle ground. BAND-MAID. Now, BAND-MAID for me are a curious one because, I mean, you could arguably say BAND-MAID are, well, obviously of the three bands we're talking about today, they're the band who I've followed the closest for the longest. They're the only band of these three who I've actually seen live. And I've seen them live quite a lot. I got their shirt over there. I didn't wear the t-shirt and hat today because I didn't want to look like I was biased on the subject. But I've got to be honest, this is obviously of the three, this is the band who I follow the most closely. This is the band that's closest to my heart of the three. So they're in an interesting ground for me though, because the reason why BAND-MAID works so well is because, as a lot of you might have noticed, or might have noted if you've been following BAND-MAID and heard the story, Konami, the lead guitarist, she is a guitarist through and through. Miku, who is the front of the band visually, she's the one who's almost like the mascot for the band. She's the one who brought the band together. She's kind of like the centerpiece of the band, but she's the only one who's not a virtuoso instrumentalist. I mean, when the band started out, she started out as the singer, but then she decided they needed a stronger singer, so she brought in Psyche to take that role. And then she needed something to do in her own band, so she decided to learn guitar off of Konami, the guitarist they brought in to play guitar for the group. So basically, she was always just filling in the space. But that's kind of what's interesting. She is what a rhythm guitarist should be. She doesn't really do solos. She's there kind of like as the anchor in the middle ground. You've got a drummer who's incredibly good and adept at like interpreting complicated rhythms, complicated things, taking like an arrangement and really pulling all the interesting rhythms out of it and turning it into something that goes underneath and just this constantly shifting but always appropriate rhythm. You've got a bassist who can be very solid herself, but also can do these very complicated little almost like solos on the bass, but fit beautifully in. Never jump out so far as to be sounding like she's looking for attention, but she's adding so much detail. And of course, you've got Konami, who, as well as being a songwriter, is a fantastic lead guitarist. So you need someone at the center who's the anchor, the person who's not going to do anything too complicated, who's just going to give the songs that rock solid center. And that, for me, is what is happening when we listen to Miku. And similar with her vocals. I mean, her vocals, with a couple of exceptions, she's primarily a backing vocalist in the band behind Psyche, therefore giving Psyche's vocals a bit of backup. She's there to be, if you like, the mortar between the bricks. And that is an incredibly useful thing to have a second guitarist to do. Does that mean that every BAND-MAID song needs two guitarists? I can think of songs by BAND-MAID that don't really need them to have two guitars, I'll be honest. But I think that there's enough songs where they have something like a riff happening over a charging rhythm that it kind of makes sense. Their songs can work that way. I think I have heard some stuff like when we were talking about Unseen World. I know some people complained on the previous couple of albums before Epic Narratives that there had been a tendency towards the songs sounding a bit too twiddly, a bit too messy. And I think this might have been really just a description of a song where there was like songs where there were so many things going on at the same time. I think that might have been one of the examples where some of the songs on Unseen World, you do wonder what they would have sounded like if there hadn't been a rhythm guitar. So I can see there are areas where that is true, but I think that BAND-MAID style leans towards the two guitarists working so well, primarily because they are so different, but primarily because one is very much just a lead guitarist. And say just, I don't mean that in a reductive way, but Konami is a lead guitarist. That's what she does. She adds color, she adds nuance, she adds riffs, she adds little details. She's adding all those little light things over the top the best part of the time. And Miku's the one who's hammering away at the chords most of the time. And that means that their roles are extremely separate. And in the case of the best bands to have two guitars, it's because the two guitars are functioning basically like they're not the same instrument. And therefore, I'd say that Lovebites are probably somewhat of an exception to the rule in that they're one of the few bands I can think of where having two lead guitarists works. Because usually when they're both playing rhythm, they're both playing rhythm together and then might as well just be one guitar. But when they play lead, that's when they become complementary more. And, just as a general rule, not saying every song, but as a general rule, that's how it works, and it seems to expand. NEMOPHILA are the kind of band where there's like so little of a rule to what they do. Their songs are so wildly different half the time that it seems structurally they could go in any direction. So in a way, it's probably best not to restrict themselves by having two guitarists and constantly having to find a role for both guitars, when instead they can just use one guitarist and play around with it. And it seems as well, then this sort of band, they're not frightened to add extra sounds. They'll put in some keyboards and synths and layer some things up in the studio anyway. So if they need extra sounds, they'll do it. And as we've seen, Mayu is happy to pick up a guitar should she need to as well. So for me, these are three very different approaches to that question. Do you need two guitarists? And in my mind, I would say, therefore, you can have, and I'm not really, so with none of these bands, just to be clear, I guess this should be obvious, with none of these bands am I saying conclusively that there is something they should or shouldn't do. More my point is that I want to question, and maybe I should have said this at the beginning, I want to question the idea that having two guitars is just a default thing that rock bands should do. I don't think it is. I don't think it's true of rock bands. I don't think it's true of metal bands. I think it's something where if you do it, you have to do it right. You have to know how you're using it. I think that BAND-MAID are probably the example of, if you're going to have two guitarists, this is the example that I would often favour. Again, I am a bit of a BAND-MAID fan, I know, so obviously I'm going to probably bias towards their sound anyway. I would say this is the best way of doing it because they've gone through, although primarily most of what they do is just hard rock, they have done very different things as well. I often cite things like Start Over, where Konami jumps on piano, but you also have things like Page, Memorable, where they got acoustic and electric. They've done songs that have gone a bit more punky. They've done songs that have been a bit more heavy metal. They always seem to be very good, though, at positioning Konami as the nuance, the detail, and as Miku being the core of the song. So for me, this is a good example of how to do it well. Lovebites is an example of something that I perhaps wouldn't usually think of myself, but demonstrates a very good different approach to it. And NEMOPHILA to me are just the perfect example of why, just because most bands have two guitarists, doesn't mean you have to. And how you're not going to find yourselves unable to do something because you don't have two guitarists. It's just a different approach. Of the three bands out here, I would say the one band that can go heaviest of all three of them is still NEMOPHILA. I think NEMOPHILA are capable of being heavier than the other two bands. Heavy is a very subjective word, I should point out. But the one who are capable of being that kind of noisy, aggressive kind of heavy, I think NEMOPHILA can go harder than either of the other two bands. And for me, as someone who I don't regard heavy as a sign of good. It's just a different sound. I'm not saying, oh, that means they're the best. But yeah, I think they can, if they want to, have shown that they can go heavier of the heaviest of the three bands. So yeah, again, it doesn't stop you being heavy. It doesn't stop you being diverse on what you do. It's just a different approach. So that's my thoughts. As always, like I said, this is an off-the-cuff episode. I can't even remember at the beginning of this episode what I suddenly decided I was going to call it. Just thought I'd talk to you guys a bit about something that I've been thinking about. So there you go. If you like this, if you want me to do more of these kind of things where I just talk about stuff, let me know. Get in the comments. Tell me what you think. Tell me why you think I'm full of shit and everything I say is totally wrong. And until I hopefully see you very soon for the next one of these. For now, ciao, ciao.